believed to ensure good ends for their mortal clients. We need look no further than the divine aid Apollo granted Augustus throughout the first emperor's providential career to understand the archetype we're talking about. There was no question that Aurelian was being protected by a powerful deity. The only question is which of the literally hundreds to choose from did Aurelian attribute his victories? The answer, helpfully, speaks to the larger religious transformation going on in the Mediterranean world during the shift into late antiquity. After following convention and identifying himself with Jupiter early in his reign, at some point, most likely during the campaign against the Palmyrene, Aurelian began to believe that he was in fact the tool of something much bigger. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, an overarching solar deity who came to serve as an important link in the ancient world's transition from polytheism to monotheism. Now, an overarching solar deity has already made an appearance in the history of Rome during the confused and doomed reign of Elagabalus. Like Elagabalus, Aurelian came to believe that Sol really was the one true god, and that all other gods were inferior. But unlike Elagabalus, Aurelian did not attempt to suppress traditional pagan religion with his kooky new theological conceptions. Aurelian saw no incompatibility between his own budding monotheism and the wider world of pagan polytheism. He paid studious attention to Jupiter and Mars and Apollo and all the other usual suspects, but with the understanding that these old gods were actually just the forms that the one true God used to manifest itself on the mortal plane. To thank his great benefactor, Aurelian established a new temple in Rome dedicated to Sol Invictus, and initiated a new priesthood dedicated to its worship. While he made no attempt to hinder any other religious activities, Aurelian, in word and deed, made it clear that he considered Sol to be the most important of all the gods, indeed, the one true God, and encouraged its worship wherever he went. In this, he was engaged not just in religious zeal, but also in a wider socio-political project he hoped would help reconnect the so recently fractured empire. From Spain to Syria and from Britain to Africa, the citizens of the empire worshipped a huge variety of gods and goddesses who often bore little resemblance to one another. Aurelian hoped to provide everyone with a single manifest god to whom they could all equally worship. The natives of Gaul and, say, the natives of Carthage worshiped their own particular gods in their own particular ways. But if, at some point during each day, they turned their attention to the great overarching Sol Invictus, then the ties that bound the far-flung corners of the empire together would be immeasurably strengthened. That was the idea, anyway. And it was an idea whose time was coming. Constantine's vision of one empire and one church was in many ways foreshadowed by Aurelian's promulgation of the cult of Sol Invictus. And indeed, this earlier promulgation made the later transition to Christianity that much easier, as Jesus Christ was eventually identified with the sun god. So, if you were comfortable with worshipping Sol Invictus, then the shift to worshipping Jesus Christ became all seamless. The last note I'll make about Aurelian's worship of the sun is that it was largely through his efforts that the Feast of the Unconquered Sun, which usually took place around December 25th, firmly took root on the Roman holiday calendar. And you should all remember from the History of Rome Christmas special that this feast was eventually claimed by the Church Fathers as the official birthday of Jesus, and is the reason we celebrate Christmas on the day that we do. It's worth noting that the switcheroo from Sol to Jesus didn't strike anyone as being too out of the blue, since, as I just mentioned, Jesus had already been firmly identified with the sun god. The unconquered restorer of the world, with the backing of the powerful Sol Invictus, next turned his attention on one of the few loose ends that had been left hanging in the past 4 years' whirlwind of activity. 14 years ago, the king of Sassanid Persia had taken the noble Emperor Valerian prisoner by means of a dirty trick. Then, he had forced Valerian to submit to all manner of humiliation and torture before the good emperor was finally allowed to die. His body, allegedly, still sat stuffed in the Sassanid throne room. If the Persians thought that all of this was going to be forgiven and forgotten, then they had another thing coming. Shortly after his defeat, Shapur had finally died. His death was a mixed bag for the Romans. On the one hand, it meant that they would not be able to exact revenge on Shapur personally. But on the other hand, it meant that the Sassanids were now dealing with a succession crisis and were divided and weak. Now would be the perfect time to kick them while they were down and take revenge for the capture of Valerian. Aurelian was not going to let this opportunity pass. Remaining in Rome for the winter, Aurelian made plans for an invasion of Persia, and in the spring of 275 set out east with his army, intent on avenging Rome's honor. He would never make it past Thrace. By far the most capable emperor since Septimius Severus, and really one of the most capable emperors ever, was cut down in the prime of his life by misguided assassins who immediately regretted their rash murder. As you can probably imagine, the stern and humorless Aurelian had very little patience for corruption and double-dealing, especially within his own staff. One of his personal secretaries had apparently lied his head off to the emperor about some random issue or another, and had either already been found out or was about to be found out, and terrified that he was going to be executed, he forged a document that purported to be a death list drawn up by the emperor with numerous high-ranking officers marked down for execution. This weaselly advisor then showed it to the high-ranking officers and let them take care of the rest. All these men knew Aurelian to be a strict and remorseless disciplinarian, and in the heat of the moment, they became convinced that if they didn't strike first, that Aurelian was going to kill them all, and unjustly at that. Encamped in Thrace in September or October of 275, the officers surprised Aurelian in his tent and stabbed him to death. Aurelian was 60 years old and had ruled the empire for 5 magnificent years. The rank and file were horrified to discover that their great general, the greatest that they had ever known, was dead, and the officers themselves were horrified when they discovered shortly thereafter the whole thing had been a trick. The secretary, I can promise you, did not come to a quick or a painless end. So, just when it looked like everything was going to be okay, the empire was suddenly thrown into its own succession crisis. Only this time, the crisis did not unfold as a battle between men vying to put their own man on the throne, but instead as a battle between men who were trying to foist the question of who would rule now onto someone else. Next week, we will watch the amusing spectacle of the Senate and the Imperial Army, who had fought each other for so long over the right to nominate emperors, each now trying to get the other to pick a new leader for Rome. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to recommend another title from the prolific Stephen Dando Collins, The Ides, Caesar's Murder and the War for Rome, a dramatic recounting of one of the most famous events in world history. I'm always down for a good Dando Collins book. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the award-winning podcast, The History of Rome. Episode 120, Interregnum. So, yeah, we won the podcast award for Best Educational Podcast of 2010. Totally cool. There is no way that I can claim any sort of sole ownership of the honor, because it was you guys out there who nominated the show, and then you guys who went and voted for it. So I consider this a win for everyone in the History of Rome community. I didn't win anything, but we just won Best Educational Podcast of 2010. Congratulations. Aurelian's assassination in late 275 AD came as a shock to everyone, and apart from a few irreconcilables in the Senate, the unconquered restorer of the world was mourned throughout the empire. The rank and file of the imperial army, still camped in Thrace, was especially grief-stricken, and their grief soon turned to anger. They wanted to know who was behind the assassination, and then they wanted them dead. It was this bloodthirsty anger that led the senior officers of the legions, most of whom had been in on the murder, to take the unprecedented step of punting on the question of succession. Normally, under these circumstances, one of them would have been put forward and acclaimed, but in this climate, imperial ambition would have been taken as evidence of guilt. What I mean by that is that the 3rd century assassinations preceding Aurelian's, those of Alexander Severus and Maximinus Thrax, and Philip the Arab, and Gallus, and Aemilianus, and Gallienus, were carried out with at least the tacit approval of the common soldiers, who understood that their erstwhile leaders needed to be pitched overboard, usually to save their own skins. But this business with Aurelian was a different animal altogether. He was popular, he was successful, and he faced no charismatic rivals who already dispatched all of those. His death was not viewed with relief, or indifference, or hope, but with anger. To come forward and claim the purple, then, looked like a quick way to get fingered for Aurelian's murder, and then get lynched by an angry mob. So the senior staff decided the safest course of action would be to ask the Senate to vote on a new emperor. That way, none of them would look like they had killed Aurelian out of crass ambition. So a few weeks after the emperor died, official envoys from the army arrived in Rome and announced to the Senate that the men of the legions humbly put the choice of Aurelian's successor into the hands of that great and ancient body. The Senate, of course, thought that this was insane. As much as they liked to whine about it, they had learned not to mess with the army on the issue of succession. The Senate's guys always got killed, and the men who put them forward usually got killed too. So, the Senate told the envoys, thanks, but no thanks. Then the envoys went back to the army, but the officers again refused to nominate one of their own, and kicked it back to the Senate. Things went on like this for a while, though exactly how long is a matter of long-standing debate. Famously, among others, the Historia Augusta reports that the interregnum lasted for a good 6 months, during which time neither side was willing to blink. In this telling, the Senate took over the day-to-day functions of the empire, while everyone waited for someone else to make the decision about who ought to be emperor. It is